and welcome to another Hayley-Roxanna crafts video. This is going to be another video on cross stitching. In particular in this video I'm going to share some tips for cross stitching on darker fabric, particularly Aida fabric. So Aida fabric comes in a variety of colours, from your lighter colours such as the whites and creams right through to the darker colours like navy and blacks. So this is a design that I stitched on some navy Aida, and as you can see it really makes the colours of the thread pop, which is why I like to stitch on dark colours sometimes, just for that different effect. But stitching on dark fabric can be a bit more challenging than when you're stitching on lighter fabric. Which is why in this video I am going to share 8 tips with you that make stitching on that darker fabric just that little bit easier. So if you want to give it a go, these may help you. So tip 1 is to make sure that you've got good lighting both above and below your project. So it's always best to ensure that you have good lighting when you're cross stitching, but it's even more important when you are working on darker fabrics. So just sitting by a window when you're stitching, if you're stitching at night, make sure you've got a light from overhead, can be helpful. However, when you're stitching on the darker fabrics, it can also be helpful to try and have light from below your work. So you can do things like putting desk lamps or other small lamps on the floor and sort of angling them up, so they shine under your work. However, if you're doing this, you do need to be careful that you don't shine the light into your eyes. Another option is to work with a light board on your lap. So this is my light board. Mine's A3 size. You can get light boards in A4 size, so that would be like half this size, and those would be perfectly fine to use as well. Mine I usually use for when I am tracing drawings onto paper or fabric, but it can also help when you are stitching on the dark fabric. So I've got some navy Aida fabric here, and I'll just pop it onto my light board like this so you can see what it looks like with no light coming up from underneath. But then if I switch my light board on, they come with varying degrees of brightness, and as you can see with that light underneath, it does make the holes a lot clearer. So just having that on your lap under your work as you're stitching will make it a lot easier to see the holes of the fabric. If you are stitching from a pattern on a tablet, you could also just put your tablet on the lap and keep it switched on, to sort of use in a similar way, so you've got that light from underneath your fabric while you're stitching. So my second tip is to cover your lap with something white. So if you can't light your fabric from underneath, or the light from underneath is not sufficient, it can also help to have something white on your lap when you're stitching. So a pillowcase or white fabric is probably best, as these would be less likely to slip off your lap. But if you've got neither available, then just some white paper would do. So if I show you fabric, so without anything underneath, my backing that I'm filming on is fairly light, so you can see the holes, but if I slide this white paper underneath, you can see that it does make the holes that bit clearer. So particularly if you are wearing dark clothes, this is particularly useful, just to help make the holes easier to see through that dark Aida as you are stitching. Tip 3 is to ensure that your fabric is held taut while you are stitching. So ensuring the fabric is taut when you're stitching helps to make the holes clearer. So I usually stitch in hand, as this is just my preferred method of stitching. So when I hold my fabric, I pop the fabric between my index finger and middle finger. I pop my thumb below where I'm stitching, and I will use my ring finger and little finger on the back just to help squeeze with my thumb just to pull the fabric tight so that it makes the holes just that little bit clearer to see. You might prefer using a hoop or a frame to hold your fabric when stitching. So this is particularly good when you are stitching on the dark fabric, because it does help to make those holes clearer to see, and particularly if you're working on a larger piece that may be more difficult to hold in hand. They can be good. So if you are using a hoop, you want to make sure that your fabric covers the whole of the hoop so that you get an even tension. And whether you're using a hoop or a frame, you want to make sure that the fabric is in it tight, but not so tight that it distorts the weave of your fabric. My fourth tip is to use a magnifier. Even if you don't normally need to magnify your work when cross stitching, you may find that you do actually need to when you're stitching on the darker fabrics. So you can buy sort of hands-free magnifiers like these, or you can get sort of freestanding ones, like part of a light like this. If you work somebody who cross stitches on frames or stands or hoops, you can get clip-on ones as well. You can also get ones that sort of go over your head like this. So you've got the light built into these and they just come down over the top. So these are okay if you wear glasses as well. But I've even heard of stitchers purchasing like the reading glasses that you can get in pharmacies that you don't actually need to go and have an eye test for to buy. People will take in their work and try the different glasses on just to see if they can find a pair that will help them purely for their cross stitching. And if you're a glasses wearer like I am, then obviously making sure that you go to your appointments and keep your prescriptions up to date does really help with your cross stitching in general, not just stitching on the darker fabrics. Tip 5 is to choose the right fabric. So the reason that I have sort of focused on the Aida fabric and used Aida fabric in my sort of demonstrations of some of these tips for stitching on the darker fabric is that the Aida fabric is probably the easiest fabric to use for cross stitching, particularly when using the darker colours, as the holes are much easier to see than say if you are using a black linen. The holes then can be really difficult to see, so it's definitely for a much more experienced stitcher. And it also helps if you stitch on a lower fabric count. So this is a 14 count navy Aida, so that means there are 14 holes per inch of fabric, rather than say a 16 or 18 count where the holes would be much closer together as there are more holes per inch. Tip 6 is to use your needle to feel the fabric. So you can use the needle to help you find the holes in your fabric. So if you just slowly drag your needle across the fabric, you can actually sort of feel dips. And these dips are where the holes are. So doing this before doing a stitch can help you to find the hole, to then push your needle through. To make sure that the needle is actually going through a hole and not between the fibres of your fabric. If you are finding it harder to push the needle through, chances are you are going through the fibres rather than down a hole. It can take practice to do this sort of dragging motion and to feel the fabric. But the more you stitch, the more you get used to it. And you do start to learn what it feels like, the difference between pushing your needle through a hole and through the actual fibres of your fabric. My 7th tip is to go slow and take lots of breaks. It will take longer to stitch a project on the darker fabric than it will when you're stitching on a lighter fabric. So you need to allow for this so that you don't feel that you need to rush your work, so you can take your time with it. And it can also be tough on your eyes when you are stitching on the darker fabric. So you need to take frequent breaks to help avoid getting eye strain. And it can also help to have a second project on the go at the same time as your project on the darker fabric, so something that you're working on a lighter fabric, just so that you can take a break from stitching on that dark fabric from time to time, especially if you are working on a larger project on your dark fabric. And my 8th and last tip for stitching on dark fabric is to pick a pattern you love. This might seem really obvious, but you need to ensure that you're going to be stitching a pattern, a design that you love. Stitching on dark fabric is hard enough without having to try and stitch something that your heart is not really in, that you don't really want to do. So picking a design that you really love is going to help immensely with stitching on the darker fabric. So I hope that these tips will help you to enjoy stitching on dark Aida fabric, and will encourage you to give it a go. I'll put the links to the items that I have shared in this video in the description. If you've got any questions, please pop them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them for you. And that's it. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in my next video.